People who love to animate will tell you up front. Creating animation is rewarding, but it can also be a slog. It takes the patience of Job and a deep commitment to make images move the way you want them to. Luckily, there are techniques in Moho that help you work smarter, not harder. And one of these techniques is Smart Bones. In part 3 of our Endless Nachos mini-series, we're going to learn about Smart Bones and how to use them. Hey, welcome to Little Green Dog's animation tutorial series. The version of Moho we'll be using is 14.3. First, we'll learn what Smart Bones are and how they work. Then we'll look at how Smart Bones were used in the Endless Nachos rig. And then, we'll complete this tutorial by creating Smart Bones for this character. If you'd like to follow along, you can download the activity files from our Ko-fi page using the link in the video description. So, what are Smart Bones? In Moho, Smart Bones are bones that control the playback of assigned keyframes. Basically, if you can keyframe it, a Smart Bone will let you control it. Let's look at the activity file called Bouncy. When I turn this Smart Bone called Spinner, it plays keyframes to spin this ball to the left or right. The next Smart Bone is called Squasher, and it plays keyframes that squash and stretch the ball. Next is a Smart Bone called Mover, and it plays keyframes to move this ball up and down. And this Smart Bone, called Bouncer, plays keyframes that turn Spinner, Squasher, and Mover all together, so I can use fewer controls to perform a more complicated animation. By the way, when you use a Smart Bone to operate other Smart Bones, it's called daisy chaining. I know. I said I wasn't going to talk about the daisy chaining technique yet, but there you go. Oops. This is a very simple daisy chain setup, and we'll learn how to make more complicated ones in the future. When a Smart Bone is used like a dial, do you know what it's called? That's right, it's called a Smart Bone dial. All right, I'm proud of you. Smart Bones can also be used inside a skeleton. In this example, bending the forearm flexes the bicep. This happens because the forearm bone is a Smart Bone. You probably noticed that in each Smart Bone example, I'm animating a single bone. So where are the animation keyframes? The animation for each Smart Bone is stored inside its Smart Bone action. We'll talk about Smart Bone actions later in this tutorial. Let's look at how Smart Bones are used in the Endless Nachos setup. On the left side of Skelly, we have several Smart Bone dials, and these control different states and animations for Skelly. These Smart Bone dials are contained inside two different bone layers, one called Snack Time and one called Skelly. In the Snack Time bone layer, we have a Smart Bone dial called Chip Switch. As you may recall from Endless Nachos Part 2, Chip Switch controls the visibility of chips in different locations. The Chip Switch Smart Bone dial uses an advanced setup, so we'll come back to this one at the end of the tutorial. The other Smart Bones use basic setups, so we'll look at them first. Now click on the bone layer called Skelly. In this bone layer, we have Skelly Skeleton and 5 more Smart Bone dials. Most of these operate switch layers. The first Smart Bone dial is called Eyes, and it operates a switch layer to open and close Skelly's eyes. Mouth operates another switch layer to switch between open and closed mouth drawings. Hand left switch switches between an open hand pose and a pinching hand pose. The next Smart Bone dial, Arm Left Z, isn't actually used in this animation, but it's an interesting setup. Turning Arm Left Z changes the sorting order, or Z depth, for parts of the arm. To see this work, let's go to a later frame, say 144, and using the Manipulate Bones tool with the Alt key pressed, pose the arm overlapping the head. Remember, the Alt key allows you to temporarily override the rig's IK, making it easier to pose each bone separately. Now I'm pressing Ctrl F to keyframe everything to hold the pose. Let's have a little fun. Phew! That's a spicy jalapeno. Where were we? Oh yeah. Turn arm LZ to the left until it stops. Notice how Skelly's arm is now completely behind his head and torso. As we turn the dial, his shoulder moves to the front. Continue turning, and now his hand moves to the front, but his shoulder moves to the back. When we reach the end of the dial, his hand and shoulder have both moved to the front. This was done by setting keyframes to the bone group's layer order inside ARM-LZ's Smart Bone action. We'll learn more about animated layer order in another tutorial. The next Smart Bone dial is called Chip Stream, and it controls the timing of the chip pieces squirting from Skelly's ribcage. Yum. The Chip Stream Smart Bone dial has keyframes for a feature called Follow Path. We'll learn more about this setup in Part 4 of this mini-series. We still need to look at the chip switch Smart Bone dial, but first, let's learn how to make Smart Bone dials. When we know how to do this, it'll be easier to understand how the chip switch Smart Bone dial works. Let's start with something easy. Or easy-ish? Open the project file called eyes. Make sure the default interpolation mode is set to copy previous key. This makes Moho's keyframing behave like After Effects, and it can make animating in Moho easier too. Copy previous key is also important for the way we're going to use Smart Bones. In this project, we have a rig for animating a pair of cartoon eyes. Go to frame 24 so we can see how it works. This rig has a root bone to move the rig, and 2 child bones to animate the direction of the eyes. Nothing fancy, right? You might recall from previous tutorials that the root is the bone that all of the character's bones are connected to, and this may include the character's Smart Bone dials. So let's add some Smart Bone dials. In the Layers window, show the layer called Overlay. This displays a guide I prepared for where to place the Smart Bone dials. It's not necessary to create a guide like this to create Smart Bones, but it will help for this tutorial. I want to create a set of Smart Bone dials for each eye, so I'll be going through the steps twice. For the right eye, I'll go through the steps slowly and explain what I'm doing. Then, for the left eye, I'll repeat the steps quickly with minimal commentary. Ready? Let's go! Make sure the playhead is on frame 0. Choose the Add Bone tool, Alt-click the root bone to select it, then, while holding Shift, drag out a small bone. Name this bone Anchor. Check on Show Label. This displays the name next to the bone. Now go to Bone Constraints and enable Independent Angle. I'll explain what this does after we finish creating our Smart Bone dials. Now press Ctrl-G to show the grid. Look under the View menu and make sure Disable Grid Snapping is unchecked. If it's checked, select it to uncheck it. This will ensure the Smart Bones are perfectly aligned as we create them. Using the grid like this makes the layout easier to work with. And it looks nicer too. With the Add Bone tool, click here to create a pin bone. This is the Smart Bone Dial Mover. So let's name it SBD Mover. When naming bones and actions, I like to use easy-to-recognize abbreviations whenever I can. Click and drag over the next marker and name the bone to match the name in the overlay. Repeat this for the remaining markers. These bones will become the Smart Bone dials in our rig. Okay, we're done with the grid, so press Ctrl-G to hide it. Choose the Select Bone tool and select all the bone dials. Check on Show Label so we can see the bone names. Choose the Reparent Bone tool and click on the SBD mover. Now check your bone hierarchy. It should look like this. The bone dials are parented to the SBD mover. The SBD mover is parented to the anchor bone. And the anchor bone is parented to the root bone. Switch back to Select Bone and select the bone dials, SBD mover, and the anchor. Select the Bone Strength tool and set the strength setting to 0. We're doing this because these bones are not part of the character skeleton, and I don't want their strength to affect the artwork. Now let's assign bone colors. This will make it easier to tell how the bones are related to what they control. I'll assign green to the right side smart bones, purple to the left smart bones, and orange to the center smart bones. You can choose different colors if you prefer. Just be consistent with how you assign them. Alright, now let's create smart bone actions for our bone dials and turn them into smart bone dials. Let's start with something simple. Select the bone called Size R. This smart bone dial is going to control the size of the eye. When we turn the bone dial, we want it to turn only so far, so let's set its rotation limits. Open Bone Constraints and check on Angle Constraints. These numbers represent how far we can turn this dial. For this dial, the default -70 and 70 settings are fine. Open the Actions window if it isn't already open. This is where we create our smart bone actions. Click the New Action button here in the corner. A window should pop up with the bone's name in it. If it doesn't show the bone name, it means you don't have the bone and the bones layer selected. This is very important, so cancel and make sure the bone and bones layer is selected before proceeding. If it shows the correct name, click OK. Moho creates a smart bone action with the bone's name, and you'll notice the timeline looks different now. This is the timeline for this smart bone action, and it's where we'll set the frame range for the smart bone and the keyframes for the animation. Let's set the frame range for the smart bone action. The range should be the number of frames you want for the animation, which should not be confused with the time it takes to play the animation. This is because the time can vary when you animate the smart bone. The number of frames should be a little longer than what you will typically need to play the animation smoothly. If that sounds a little vague, you're right, it is. But don't worry about it. After making a few smart bones and animating them, you'll get a feel for what's appropriate. I want this smart bone action to range 48 frames, so move the playhead to frame 48. To set a keyframe at the end of the range, turn the bone dial all the way to the right. OK. Now let's set the beginning of the range. To do this, double-click on frame 1 to create another keyframe. Setting the first keyframe in the range after I create the last keyframe puts a slight offset in the angle of the smart bone, which is important because this is going to be a bidirectional smart bone. That probably sounds like crazy talk, but it'll make sense in just a minute. Now select frames 1 and 48. Right-click over a keyframe and choose Linear. This sets the interpolation mode for the smart bone to linear, which is what we normally want for a smart bone. If you're wondering why I set a keyframe at frame 1, it's so I can set a different interpolation mode for frame 0, which will be the default interpolation mode for the regular timeline. In this case, for example, I want the smart bone to have linear keyframes in the smart bone action timeline, but I want to animate the smart bone using smooth keyframes in the regular timeline. By the way, the regular timeline in Moho is called the main line. You'll be hearing this term a lot in this tutorial. Now let's set keyframes for the action to animate the eye size. Click on the iris layer for the right eye, and choose the Transform Layer tool. Make sure the playhead is on frame 1, and click on the corner of the Transform widget. This sets the beginning of the animation. Now go to frame 48, and shrink the layer to about 30% of its size. Let's make it exact by entering 30% in all 3 scale boxes. Select the keyframes for frames 1 and 48 and set them to linear. When we scrub the playhead, we should see the smart bone turning and the eye contracting as the bone turns. Let's test this on the main line. Double-click on Main Line, and this returns us to the regular animation timeline, or the main line. I like to use frame 24 when I'm testing, so I'm moving the playhead to frame 24. It really doesn't matter which frame we're on, so long as it's an animation frame, which is any frame above frame 0. Make sure the bone layer is selected. Choose the Manipulate Bones tool. Turn the smart bone to the right, and the eye should shrink. We just created our first smart bone. Yay! That probably seemed like a lot of steps, but trust me, the process gets faster, and it will become second nature when you get the hang of it. Okay, remember I said this was going to be a bidirectional smart bone? This means we're creating a second smart bone action for the same smart bone. With the size R smart bone still selected, click on the New Action button. The window will appear with the bone name, but this time there should be a number 2 after the name. This means Moho is creating a second action for this smart bone. Click OK. Move the playhead to frame 48 and create a keyframe by turning the bone to the left. Click on frame 1 to create the first keyframe for the action, and set the interpolation mode to linear for frames 1 and 48. Remember when I said the reason I create the first keyframe after creating the last keyframe is to record a slight rotation in the bone? It's the same reason here, but the rotation angle is in the opposite direction. And this prevents a conflict from occurring between these 2 smart bone actions. Also, with keyframes in both actions set at frame 1, I'm still free to set the interpolation mode for frame 0 to be whatever it needs to be for the main line. If this sounds confusing, it'll make sense the first time you mess it up. So just remember, you can come back to this video when you need to troubleshoot something later. Let's set the animation keyframes. Move the playhead to frame 1. Select the iris layer for the right eye. Choose the Transform Layer tool and click the corner of the widget. Go to frame 48 and scale the layer to double size. Let's make it exact by entering 200%. Select the keyframes for frames 1 and 48 and set them to linear. Scrub to check the motions. Looks good. Let's go to the main line to test it. Go to frame 24 and rotate the smart bone dial. Turning it to the right will make the eye grow smaller, and turning it to the left will make the eye grow bigger. And that's how you make a bidirectional smart bone. Good job! I knew you could do it. Okay, we've more or less covered the basics, so we're going to pick up the pace now. Let's work on the wink down smart bone. First, select the bone, and then set the angle constraints. This dial will turn in one direction only, so I'm setting it to -70 and 0. Actually, let's do this. All the smart bones in this row are going to have the same angle constraints. So select the next 3 bones and set the angle constraints to -70 and 0. Cool. Now they're all set to the same values. I just wanted to show that you can edit certain items in batches, which can be a big time saver. Okay, back to Wink Down R. Select the bone and click New Action. Name looks good. Click OK. Playhead on frame 48. Turn the bone to set the Smart Bones end keyframe. Double-click frame 1 to set the start keyframe. Select the keyframes and set them to linear. Now let's animate the right eye's eyelids. Select the layer called Eye. Make sure you're on frame 1. Choose the Transform Points tool and press Ctrl F. This sets the keyframe for all the points. Go to frame 48 and drag the top point to the green guideline. Now drag the bottom point to the green guideline to make a sleepy closed eye. Select frames 1 and 48 and set their interpolation to linear. Check the motions. Double-click on main line. Go to frame 24 and test the smart bone. Looks good. Let's repeat this for Wink Up R. We're making a slightly different animation for this one. Set the smart bone keyframes and make them linear. Now select the eye layer, select the Transform Points tool, move the playhead to frame 1, press Ctrl F to set a keyframe at frame 1, move the playhead to frame 48, and drag the top and bottom points to the purple guideline to make this one into a smiley closed eye. Set the keyframes to linear check the motions, go to the main line and test it, I approve. Now, some of you might be wondering, how was I able to reshape that circle? So let's take a moment to look at it. Normally, when we drag a top and bottom point in a circle, we get this mess. To get the result we saw in the eye rig, I set the side points to peak, which is done by selecting the Curvature tool, selecting the points, and clicking the Peak button. Then I selected the top and bottom points and increased the curvature to get back the circle shape. Now I can move these points and have sharp corners on the sides. This easy technique doesn't really work for other cartoon styles and more realistic eyes, but it works great for perfectly round, circle-shaped eyes. There are probably as many different ways to rig eyelids as there are for drawing different styles of eyes, and I'll show you some of them in future tutorials about rigging eyes. And now, back to our regularly scheduled tutorial. So that completes one side of Smart Bones. Now let's do the other side, but this time with no commentary, to show how quickly this can be done. All right, that hardly took any time, right? Here's what we've got. Size controls for the right and left eye, and wink down and wink up controls for each eye. I want to add one more smart bone dial. This one is called Blink, and it's another bidirectional smart bone. Let's use the default angle constraints and create the first action. As usual, we'll set the range keyframes for the bone. For the animation, we're going to do something different this time. Instead of animating the artwork directly, let's set keyframes for the wink down R and wink down L smart bones. You may have noticed that sometimes I'll use the right-click command, select keys to right, and other times I'll drag select the keys directly. It really doesn't matter how you select the keys, you just need to be sure you select the right keys. For smart bones, that's typically keys on frames 1 and above. Now, with the blink bone selected, I'm going to create our second action, and this one will control the wink up R and wink up L smart bones. Let's go to the main line and frame 24 to test blink. When we turn blink to the right, it closes both eyes into a sleepy pose. And when we turn blink to the left, it closes both eyes into a smiley pose. Pretty cool, huh? And yes, this is what we call daisy chaining smart bones. That is, getting one smart bone to operate another. In this case, it's one smart bone operating two smart bones. Daisy chaining can get very complex, and we'll learn more about this technique in another tutorial. By the way, there are a few things we can do to improve this eye rig, and we'll learn how in a special addendum to this tutorial called Return of the Simple Eye Rig, coming soon. Okay, are we ready to make smart bones for an entire character now? I think so. Let's do it. This is Mr. Smarty Bones, and he's volunteered to be our victim. I mean subject. The rig structure is similar to our previous rig. There's an anchor bone parented to the root, a mover bone parented to the anchor, and all the bone dials are parented to the mover. To save a little time, I already named the bones and set their bone strength to 0. I also created the smart bones to control his eyes. These smart bones are similar to the ones we made earlier, and there's nothing new here. So let's move on to the next smart bone, which is called Paw Roll R. It's another bidirectional control, so let's enable the angle constraints. Create the first action. Set the range for the smart bone. And set the keyframes to linear. Now let's keyframe the animation. Select the paw pad layer. Move the playhead to frame 1. Choose the Transform Layer tool and set a keyframe for the layer position by clicking on it. Go to frame 48, and with the Shift key pressed, move the layer downward until the upper toe lines are centered with the paw. Set the keyframes to linear. Now do the same for the second action. This time, we move the layer upward. Go to the main line and test it on frame 24. Cool. This is how we turn Mr. Smarty Bones' paw. Here's another time-saving trick. If we click the toggle frame 0 button here on the left side of the timeline, Moho jumps to frame 0, and it remembers where it was, so when we click it again, it returns us to frame 24. Okay, moving on. Let's repeat these steps for the paw roll L Smart Bone. Select the bone, check on the angle constraints, make the first action, set the range for the action, animate the layer, make the second action. Oops, need to select the bone layer. That's better. See, I make mistakes too. It's no big deal. Set the range, animate the layer, test it, looking good. Now let's make a body turn Smart Bone. This is a similar bidirectional setup, because all we're doing is sliding the buckle layer so it looks like the body is turning. Sliding items like this might seem like cheating, but you'd be surprised by how well this trick works, even with more realistic designs. Test it. Yeah, that looks good to me. Remember to save your work. Now let's make a head turn smart bone. Set up the first smart bone action. This is another similar setup, except this time we're moving this face bone, which moves all the face parts attached to it. Be sure to press and hold the Shift key because we want the bone to move only sideways along the x-axis. We'll be moving the face bone along the y-axis in another smart bone, and we don't want to create a conflict between the two. I want the end of the muzzle to move a little extra to give the animation some depth, so I've attached it to this bone called muzzle. Let's also move the ears. These are moving in the opposite direction because they're on the far side of the head. Normally, I would test this action on the main line, but I feel pretty good about this, so let's move on to the second smart bone action. Be sure to select the head turn smart bone before clicking the new action button. Okay, now let's test it. It's good. Now let's make a head tilt smart bone. This is the same as the head turn smart bone, except we're animating the face bone moving up and down along the y-axis. Select the head tilt smart bone, set its constraints, and create the first head tilt action. Select the face bone and with the Transform Bone tool, press the Shift key and move the bone upward. Now let's move the muzzle bone for the added depth effect. Let's also move the ear bones downward so they look like they're going behind the head. Select the keyframes from frames 1 through 48 and set them to linear. Now make the second action to tilt the head forward. Move the face bone downward. I'm going to move the ears upward for half the animation and then downward to the end. This should look like the ears are coming from the back and over the top. Select the keyframes from frames 1 through 48 and set them to linear. Wow, deja vu anyone? Time to test it. Does this look good?
Yes.
Are we done?
No.
We have 3 more smart bones to make. To operate Mr. Smarty Bone's mouth, we're going to use this mouth pose smart bone. Normally, I would use the switch selection window to animate a mouth switch. However, for this example, we're going to use a smart bone to learn how to make it set nonlinear keyframes for a switch layer. This smart bone only needs to turn in one direction. So I'm going to set the constraints to -90 and 0. This constrains it to turn 90 degrees to the right. Now let's create the mouth pose action. This time we're changing the interpolation mode for frame 0 to step. I'll explain why in just a minute. Now select the switch layer and make sure you're on frame 1. Press Ctrl-Alt and right-click over the mouth. Select Neutral to set a keyframe for the neutral drawing. For switch layers, the bottom item is always the first. This is because it's easier to add new layers to the top of the list. Now press the right arrow to step into frame 2, and set the switch layer to Open. Step into frame 3, set it to O. Frame 4 to GK. Frame 5 to Smile. And frame 6 to Cheerful. Remember earlier when I said a smart bone's range is the number of frames in the animation? This is what I meant. Because we have only 6 frames here, and the smart bone's range is 48, we need to shorten the range of the smart bone to fit the range of the animation. We know this animation ends on frame 6, but I'm going to move the smart bone's end keyframe to frame 7 to give it a little extra padding. I do this to be certain the last frame kicks in before reaching the end of the dial. I'm also going to delete frame 1 for the smart bone and recreate it. This will record the new rotation offset for the smart bone. Also, make sure this keyframe is linear. Even though we set frame 0 to be a step frame, we still want the smart bone's frame range to be linear. By the way, if you add more drawings to this switch layer later, remember to adjust the smart bone's range to cover them. Okay, let's go to the main line and see what we've got. Now, when we turn the mouth pose dial, Moho creates a step frame. This happens because we changed the interpolation for frame 0 to step frame when we created the smart bone. The step frame is critical to this type of smart bone because it allows us to display the mouth drawings in any order we want. If we use smooth or linear keyframes, Moho plays all the switch layer drawings in between the keyframes in sequence, which is fine when that's what you need, but it's completely useless for lip sync animation. However, when we use step keyframes, Moho will hold the drawing until it sees the next keyframe. This is a very good example of why it's important to keyframe frame 1 inside your smart bone action. Here's a bonus tip. If you want to get fancy, we can reopen the mouth pose smart bone, copy the keyframes from the mouth switch layer, then go into the Overlays folder, select the mouth label switch layer, move the playhead to frame 0, and paste the keyframes. Now we have text labels near the smart bone that change with the mouth switch drawings. Okay, we're done with the smart bone dials. But wait a minute, I said we had 3 more smart bones to make. So where are the remaining 2? These smart bones are not dials, but they are part of Mr. Smarty Bone's skeleton. Let's delete the keyframes in the bone layer and move the playhead to our test frame. Now let's pose his arms. Notice how the elbow looks a bit wonky? This is because we have a smooth point at the elbow joint, and we need to make it a sharp corner point. We can use a smart bone action to fix this. Select the lower right arm bone. This bone is going to be the bidirectional smart bone for the right elbow. I'm not bothering to set angle constraints for this bone because I want the arm to turn freely. So let's go straight to making a new smart bone action. Go to frame 48, and using Transform Bone, bend the arm to about here. By now, you should know that this creates our end keyframe for the action. Double-click on frame 1 to set the start keyframe. Select keyframes 1 and 48 and set them to linear. Now let's make the animation. Alt-right-click to select the arm layer and move the playhead to frame 1. Choose the Curvature tool. Uncheck Show Bezier Handles if it's on, because we don't want to accidentally keyframe the handles, we only want to keyframe the points. Press the Control button and drag select the 2 points at the elbow joint. Click on the Smooth button. This sets the curvature to smooth points. These points are actually smooth already, but since I'm going to animate the curvature, I want to define their smoothness at frame 1. Move the playhead to frame 24. Control and click an empty area to drop the selection. Control drag to select only the top elbow point, and this time click the Peak button. This sets the curvature to a sharp corner point. Click and drag over the bottom elbow point to make it a little less rounded. Let's check the animation by scrubbing the playhead. I think this can happen sooner, so let's move these keys to frame 12. Move the playhead to frame 48, and let's make the elbow a little more rounded here. This restores some of the volume in the arm so it doesn't get too skinny. Up to now, we've mostly used linear keyframes for the animation. But in this situation, I'm going to keep the smooth keyframes because the animation is more organic, and I think it'll look better. It's a judgment call. I could feel differently about this later and change it then. It's no big deal. To keep things rolling, I'm going to skip testing for now and go directly to making the second action. Select the bone layer, select the bone, and click the New Action button. We should see the bone name followed by the number 2. Set up the Smart Bones range, use Alt-click to select the arm artwork. We're going to do the same thing we did for the first action, but on the opposite side of the arm. So, on frame 1, with the curvature tool selected, Control-drag to select the middle points and click the Smooth button. Move the playhead to frame 12, set the bottom point to peak, and make the top point a little less rounded. Go to frame 48 and make the top point a little more rounded. Now let's test it. Go to the main line, frame 24. Yeah. Compare this to the left arm, and it looks much better. Okay, let's work on the left arm. I'll refrain from commenting this time, so sit back and enjoy the music. That takes care of the smart bones, but before we move on, I want to show two more things. First, let's talk about the mover bone and the anchor bone. Why did I add these instead of parenting all these smart bones directly to the root bone? Well, the mover bone makes it easier to move the smart bones to another area of the screen. For example, let's say another character was standing in this area, and it became too hard to see the controls. Well, in this situation, we can move the mover bone to another part of the screen. Makes sense, right? And the anchor bone makes sure the smart bones move with the character when I move its root bone, like this. But additionally, when I rotate the root bone, the anchor bone keeps the smart bone dials vertically aligned. This happens because we enabled independent angle in the anchor bone's constraint settings. This option makes the bone ignore the rotation of its parent bones. Independent angle is a very useful option, and I'll show more ways to use it in a future tutorial. Let's do one more thing with this rig before moving on. We have 3 bones in this rig that should not be touched by the animator. And these bones are the anchor bone and these 2 elbow bones. The elbow bones are used to preserve the volume of the elbow region. I'll explain how they work in an upcoming tutorial about rigging joints. All you need to know right now is that they should never be keyframed. To prevent accidentally keyframing these bones, I select them, and then I check the option called Shy Bone. This hides the bones, but unlike the Hide Bones command, I can toggle their visibility by using the menu command Hide Show Shy Bones. This is useful when you need to edit any of the shy bones later and want to quickly hide them again. Let's review what we just learned about smart bones. To create a smart bone, the bone layer and the bone must be selected. After clicking the New Action button, make sure you see the selected bone's name in the action name. If you don't see the bone name, it means you probably don't have the bone and the bone layer selected. When keyframing the animation range for a smart bone, set the end keyframe first, then set the first keyframe. This ensures that the bone's rotation on frame 1 is slightly offset to prevent a conflict with the second smart bone action. Obviously, this is more important for a bidirectional smart bone, but I'll still do this for a single direction smart bone in case I change my mind about turning it into a bidirectional smart bone later. Set the interpolation mode for the smart bone's keys from frame 1 and above to linear. This makes the smart bone's base timing rate constant, which is what you want for a smart bone. The smart bone's interpolation mode at frame 0, on the other hand, can be smooth or whatever you want it to be for the mainline animation. For the smart bone's animated items, the offset at frame 1 isn't required, and this includes other smart bones animated in daisy chain setups. However, I like to at least keyframe them at frame 1 to set their interpolation mode. I typically use linear here because it's easier to keep multiple items in sync this way. But these animation keys can practically be anything they need to be. For example, I may use the cycle interpolation when the animation needs to play multiple times inside the action. Finally, when the project's default interpolation mode is set to copy previous key, use frame 0 to set a channel's default interpolation mode. Animating in Moho is much easier this way. Now, about that chip switch smart bone dial. This smart bone uses a technique called nested smart bones, which means the chip switch smart bone is located in a parent bones group layer called snack time, and the rest of the smart bones are in a separate child bones group layer called skelly. So, why did I do this? It's because I needed chip switch to operate the visibility of chips inside the snack time bones group and the visibility of chips inside the skelly bones group. This nesting setup is fairly simple, but it can get complicated when you start using smart bones to operate other smart bones inside a nested bones layer. That's an advanced technique, and we'll explore it another time. Right now, I hear music, and you know what that means. I want to thank all our supporters who donated or purchased something from our Ko-fi page. Remember, when you contribute to our Ko-fi page and become a supporter, you'll see your name in the credits of our next tutorial, get access to supporter-only posts for a month, and a link to download free stuff. So, what did you think, Mr. Smarty Bones?
Excellent work, everyone. Thank you so much for rigging me.
I feel like I have 10 lives now.